The Aperture Science Enrichment Center advises all participants to be aware of the following side effects to this presentation: heart palpitations, an intense craving for cinnamon, and spoilers for the games Portal and Portal 2. If you experience these symptoms, please speak to a test associate who can provide you with memory wiping and, where available, cinnamon-flavored baked goods. Aperture Science does not take any responsibility. Your cooperation is noted.
Dig deep enough through the internet and you will find a layer of "the cake is a lie" memes. It's the lining between the rigid and stiffer mantles of the internet structure sitting between a film of lolcats and a haphazard foundation of Rick Astley music videos. It's honestly quite tiresome hearing the line now, so it's easy to forget why this line resonated so heavily with nerds everywhere back in 2007, which is back when Portal came out. It was a unique and exciting bonus game tucked away on Valve's Orange Box. While many were here for Half-Life 2's latest episode and the revival of Team Fortress, Portal ended up stealing the show. A tightly focused 2 to 3 hour experience with endlessly quotable lines that won instantaneous critical acclaim and a robust fandom. But one thing occurs to me. While the game is often praised for its writing, I realised that it did something even more unique. You see, while game writing is improving all the time, it typically tells stories that could easily be adapted into other mediums. Our previous 2 episodes proved this. Control's narrative could easily be thrown into a Lynchian sci-fi movie or a House of Leaves style novel without too much effort. And Uncharted is a straightforward action-adventure that you could strip out the cutscenes of and turn straight into a movie, and yet still, somehow, the endlessly delayed film adaptation continues to mess this up. The more I think about it, the more I realise that Portal and its sequel tell a story that is uniquely video gamey. No matter how hard I try, I cannot imagine the story of this game being mangled into another medium, and I find that really interesting. So interesting, in fact, that this is the focus of today's episode of Losing the Plot. Today, friends, I'll be looking at the various aspects of Portal's narrative that make it a story that could only ever exist in a game. The first thing that makes Portal so tricky to adapt is its central gameplay mechanic. After all, Portal was never designed with the story as its first aspect. It was, of course, an expansion of a student project that impressed Valve. Nobacular Drop was a puzzle adventure game where you could place warp gates around the world to solve conundrums, and was so unique and interesting that Valve snapped up the whole team and told them, make that, but better. The result was Portal, now sporting a sleeker sci-fi aesthetic and a new first-person perspective, but the central mechanic remained the same. You can place 2 portals. Use these portals to solve puzzles, and away you go. The plot was developed to facilitate this, to give the player a reason to move through the test chambers. And you know what? This would make a rubbish film. Ultimately, the game's appeal comes from trying to figure out what you're doing, where to place your portals and make that work with energy pellets and cubes and other paraphernalia. And converting that into a non-interactive medium would be about as interesting as a 2-hour movie about a man doing a crossword. Yes, I'm aware that that movie would win awards in some French art house festival, but for the rest of us, it would be the worst. Imagine a movie where Chell wanders through a facility shooting portals around. It would be incredibly boring, no matter how impressive they made the momentum-based puzzles look in the process. But there's another aspect to the gameplay that makes the story exclusively work as a game, and that's the fact that almost the entire game of Portal is a long tutorial. A sneaky one that works so effectively it's hard to even notice the game's teaching you things until you look back at it all at the end and realise that each of the 19 test chambers is teaching you or testing you on something you just learned. Developer commentary backs this up too, and the game structure has been endlessly debated in game design videos for the last 10 years. The first room of the game introduces the concept of a portal and the painfully complex concept of using a box to hold down a button to open a door. The second room introduces the concept that portals can be used to reach different locations. The third room lets you place portals of your own, and room 4 introduces the concept that portals work both ways, and tries to push away the idea that blue portals are entrance only, which they are not. If this was a movie, it would be a series of instructions given to a character on screen, and in most movies this is the kind of thing that would get skipped into a montage, probably with some rad 80s music. And the problem with this is you'd be cutting out the bulk of the experience. Portal is about solving puzzles, there is no way around this. But it doesn't fall flat in the way that later imitators like the Turing test do. So what did Valve do to give the experience momentum? Your guide through the initial tutorial portion of the game is a robotic voice that speaks to you as soon as you wake up.
Hello, and again, welcome to the Aperture Science Computer-Aided Enrichment Center. We hope your brief detention in the relaxation vault has been a pleasant one.
A cold robotic voice that talks in very specific technical ways, implying the test you're about to undertake is AI guided rather than human guided. It seems fair at first, except this AI glitches out almost immediately, and continues to glitch out throughout the game.
For your own safety and the safety of others, please refrain from turn back.
The coldness of the voice is also unnerving. This AI comes out with a lot of bizarre statements said in a monotone, matter-of-fact way. A way that highly suggests that this AI does not care about you.
Please be advised that a noticeable taste of blood is not part of any test protocol, but is an unintended side effect of the Aperture Science Material Emancipation Grip, which may, in semi-rare cases, emancipate dental fillings, crowns, tooth enamel, and teeth. You,
Subject name here.
must be the pride of.
Subject hometown here.
The Enrichment Center regrets to inform you that this next test is impossible. Make no attempt to solve it.
This AI, later revealed to be named GLaDOS, or Genetic Life Form and Disk Operating System, is actually a deconstruction of a video game trope. By this point, many games had adopted the system of a disembodied voice telling you where to go and what to do, and by 2007, developers were already looking to subvert this. BioShock, released the same year, decided to make the nature of your radio assistance the game's major twist. The same is true of Portal, except it's a bit more upfront with it, since you're likely to be suspicious from the very beginning. GLaDOS is one of the most notable examples of a game calling the practice of a disembodied tutorial or mission control voice into question. It's something that we'd see more of in the later decade, with the Stanley Parable being the most notable example, as it turned that subversion into a game in its own right. It's also notable because its origin as a Half-Life mod means that it's actually built in the same engine as Portal. While initially some of GLaDOS's glitches and quirks are subtle, they ramp up as the game progresses, with the lines getting more and more sinister. The line,
The Enrichment Center is required to remind you that you will be baked, and then there will be cake.
is especially odd. I will be baked? What does that mean? All of this is played for laughs, of course, but there's a sense of dread behind it too. Dread that creeps in if you stop and look around the rooms occasionally, only to realise there's an awful lot of observation rooms meant for other human beings to exist in, and yet you never see another soul. Instead, you endlessly face a series of cold, clinical rooms with only machines for company, a robotic voice, the machinery of the tests, and eventually murderous yet adorable turrets. It's in the turret introduction that the environmental storytelling really comes together. Venture through the test chamber far enough and you'll encounter a wall panel seemingly forced out and propped open by a stack of cubes. Inside, the scribblings of a madman and evidence of someone having lived there. Among the scrawlings were pictures of the cameras and turrets, countdown markers, and the now infamous phrase, "The cake is a lie." Not long before this, GLaDOS does mention that cake and grief counselling will be available at the end of the test, a slightly silly comment that takes on a darker tone as soon as you find this room. GLaDOS has promised cake at the end of the test, but now it's apparently a lie, and the state of this room suggests the truth is something that drove this room's former occupant mad. This isn't the only room you'll find all this stuff in, but this first instance sows those seeds of doubt. None of this would work as effectively in another medium. In a film, the observation rooms would need to be shown and run the risk of being either too subtle or too obvious in the process. The mad rantings in the hidden room are essential to the story, which is why the hidden room wasn't really all that hidden when you encounter it. A scene in a movie where Chell nips into a side room and reads some writing on a wall would be terribly on the nose. It's through the player's own exploration that they are rewarded with these plot elements, which they must piece together. Since I mentioned Chell, her role in this story is a notable one. She's canonically mute, as remarked by GLaDOS herself in the second game, and backed up by comments from writer Eric Walpole, who states that she can talk, but chooses not to, so the other characters don't get the satisfaction of a response. In reality, she's a typical silent protagonist, whose purpose is for the player to put themselves in the shoes of. Her lack of reaction to any of the passive-aggressive comments from a computer, the betrayal of being lowered into an incinerator, or really much of anything at all, happens for a reason. Because you, the player, must fill in the gaps. Your reaction to what's happening is Chel's reaction. We also have no detail on who Chel actually is. We know her name, mainly from supplemental materials and developer commentary. We know what she looks like because we can see her through portals. And we know that she's likely to end up in the facility as an Aperture Science employee's daughter, submitting a science project on Bring Your Daughter to Work Day, as environmental evidence shows in Portal 2. She also may be adopted, judging by GLaDOS's comments at the end of the first game and the endless mocking throughout early chapters of Portal 2. Of course, GLaDOS also mocks Chel for being fat, and I mean really, come on now, look at her. As funny as this line is...
Look at you, sailing through the air majestically, like an eagle, piloting a blimp.
It's also massively unrepresentative of Chel's body type, so perhaps we can take the adopted fact with a grain of salt too. Now imagine trying to adapt this for a movie. You'd have to give her a personality, you'd have to have her speak, and part of the genius of Portal's writing comes from how the player personally reacts to GLaDOS, or in the sequel to Wheatley or Cave Johnson. It would ruin it. Just like how the game thrives on the challenge of the puzzles, and how exploration rewards the player with clues about what's really going on, how the player reacts to what's happening is also central to the experience. Hearing GLaDOS randomly say something like this is supposed to make the player stop and say, what was that? It's not meant to have another character react to it or issue a quip. Portal's writing is effective because it's designed for player interaction, and everyone's personal reaction to it is pretty much valid as canon, no matter how much it differs from person to person. Then there's the companion cube, a game mechanic turned into a silly joke, as is Portal's general theme. The forced act of euthanizing your faithful companion cube is supposed to make the player stop and consider their reaction to this. Do you just chuck it into the fire, believing something to be just weird about the AI? Do you chuckle at the absurdity before pausing to wonder if there's actually something to her comments? Or do you cling hopelessly to the cube as your only friend in this isolation? The correct response is simply all of the above. Every player's response is valid, and that's the point. You simply could not present this supposed moral quandary in a movie without looking a bit silly. Imagine Chel clinging to the cube and yelling at GLaDOS that it's her best friend. Portal's supposed to be funny, of course, but presenting the same scene in this way would eliminate the subtle dread lying underneath the humour of Portal, and would ignore that the bond formed between cube and player comes from having to interact with the cube throughout the whole test chamber to solve puzzles. Once again, player agency is central to all of this. But that's Portal 1. The sequel, released in 2011, is a bigger game and features more characters, such as moronic Orb Wheatley,
alright, fatty, adopted fatty, fatty, no parents.
Played by the excellent Stephen Merchant.
Don't have a go at the eyes, because that is a stigmatism that I've had from the age of 5, so that's what makes them a bit bulbous. So don't just go with that. I didn't call you like Whale Man or the Blubber Man.
And you also have Cave Johnson.
Bean counter said I couldn't fire a man just for being in a wheelchair. Did it anyway. Ramps are expensive.
Played equally excellently by my candidate for Sully in a proper Uncharted movie, J.K. Simmons.
Where you been? Looking for you all morning. Why don't you pay your phone bill? Mad scientist goes berserk and we don't have pictures.
So surely with more characters there's more interaction going on and therefore more capability to adapt this to film. Well, not quite, and this is made clear from the outset. The first scene of the game, where Chel wakes up from stasis and walks around performing some basic tasks, serves to illustrate the stasis wake-ups working as intended, but also teaches the player how to move around. If this was an opening scene of a movie, it may work, but it would feel forced and awkward. This is immediately followed by a wake-up call from Wheatley at a much later interval of 9. In this initial interaction, Chel is still very much mute, and now the game actively draws attention to it.
Do you understand what I'm saying at all? Does any of this make any sense? Just tell me, just say yes. Okay, what you're doing there is jumping. You just jumped.
This is a brilliant joke, and it's a joke that only works with the mechanics of the game in mind. If this was to happen in a movie, it would be a surreal bit of Python-esque comedy that would be initially funny, but then just confusing if you thought about it a bit more. In Portal 2, it's funny because you realise this is the game telling you how to jump in its typical hidden tutorial sort of way, and it's excellent. In essence, it's continuing the tutorial subversions set by its predecessor, and setting the tone for the game to come. Interactions with Wheatley aren't much different to GLaDOS, with the exception that his affable Bristolian accent sends the clear message that he doesn't intend to kill you, at least not yet.
This is the part where I kill you.
He mostly rambles on at you as you try and escape, and your reaction is supposed to be Chell's, just like how you'd react to GLaDOS in the first game. Cave Johnson is an even worse prospect for this, on account of him having died long before the events of the first game. His presence is limited to pre-recorded messages.
Make more pre-recorded messages.
This means that you have even less interaction with him than GLaDOS in the first game. The two of you exist in two separate timelines. Based on Chell's perceived age, the release date of Portal, and the fact that Johnson clearly died in the 80s, it's unlikely the two characters were ever alive at the same time, and if they were, Chell would have been just born. Not a lot of potential for interaction here, to be honest. What about GLaDOS though? Could interactions with her be adapted this time? Because while you did take her out at the end, she did confirm, in song form, that she was still alive, and the sequel brings her back to prove this. GLaDOS's interactions with the player in Portal 2 are vastly different than in the previous game. She's snarkier, more passive-aggressive, and generally more comic. It might seem like a drastic change, but it's a logical one. Two of the player's actions at the end of Portal have caused this, with the removal of the morality core and then outright killing her. Her less robotic personality in 2 can actually be seen directly in the final boss confrontation of 1. And if you combine this with a desire for revenge, which she admits in a roundabout way,
I was able, well, forced really, to relive you killing me again and again, forever. You know, if you'd done that to somebody else, they might devote their existence to exacting revenge.
it's a very clear shift in personality that explains her tone towards you throughout the game. Of course, because all of these interactions are dependent on a familiarity with the events of the first game, it makes it harder to adapt this sequel too. Much of GLaDOS's comments refer back to the events of the first game. There's her passive aggressiveness regarding you killing her, and an extended joke about Chell's parents that expands on her previously mentioned joke at the end of the first game.
It also says she murdered him, so that's on you too.
The birth parents you are trying to reach do not love you. Please hang up.
Oh, that's sad.
The first third of the game even actively reflects the first game. While travelling with Wheatley, you travel through the dilapidated ruins of the initial test chambers, as the facility has fallen into ruin and decay. These test chambers offer up much of the same tutorial aspects as they originally did, but also offer a new perspective on those familiar areas for those who played the first game. We can see the original facade literally falling away, and we get more insight into just where all these chambers are in relation to the wider facility. Once GLaDOS is reawakened, she forces you through a new round of tests. These tests actually start with a visit through Test Chamber 19 in reverse, with you emerging from the incinerator and progressing out into brand new tests. These new tests feel like expansions on the original formula, adding in new elements to test you, but they also act as a gradual progression of the plot as GLaDOS rebuilds the facility around you. Indeed, as she finishes rebuilding, Wheatley returns, and you're able to resume your escape. But this entire sequence is simply a rehash of the first game's structure, with Wheatley's guided escape resembling the original escape sequence, and the confrontation with GLaDOS coming in roughly at the same number of playtime hours as the entire original game. All of this makes it clear that Portal 2 is not a standalone title. Familiarity with the original events make for a better experience, and so many of the problems of adapting the first game into another medium carry over to the sequel, even though much of the tone has shifted and story sequences are much more complex. While putting this video together, I was able to assess what Portal 1 was. It's an extended tutorial for a puzzle game, which is all about the creeping horror of discovering just who was guiding you through the tests. But what is Portal 2? There's less creeping dread because you already know who GLaDOS is, but that's not the point of it. It's an expansion to the first game, one that allows you to experience more challenges beyond the limited scope of that game, and in the process opens up even more discoveries about Aperture Science and just what they're trying to do in this enrichment center. But in all of this, you're carrying on the discoveries of the first game. While you got glimpses of the behind the scenes areas between the hidden rooms in the escape of the first game, Portal 2 gives you endless glimpses behind the scenes. As previously mentioned, the initial parts of the game feature ruined test chambers with crumbling walls that expose the facade, and GLaDOS building test chambers later on means you can't forget what's behind the walls there either. And that's when you're not actively nipping in and out of the backroom areas anyway, as so much of the game does. Once you've replaced GLaDOS with Wheatley, he turns evil and then throws you into a pit, and you fall back to the old parts of Aperture. Here you discover just how ridiculous the company is. They've existed since the 50s, but rather than upgrade their existing facilities, they just build entirely new ones on top of the old ones. You also learn that their founder, the aforementioned Cave Johnson, was basically a mad scientist who threw science at the wall just to see what would stick. This starts to explain why the tests that are so essential to Aperture appear to have no endgame. They really don't, they're just there so people can throw portals around, simply because they invented a portal gun. And none of this is really spelled out explicitly. You discover all of this by moving through the old facilities, listening to Cave Johnson's messages, and then filling in the rest for yourself. Environmental evidence tells you that Aperture used to make shower curtains and created the portal gun by accident, an especially funny touch that I love. The budgetary issues that the company gradually faced became increasingly apparent as they moved from more lavish waiting area lounges in the 50s to a tiny box full of cheap plastic chairs in the 70s. Cave's messages too go from enthusiastically welcoming athletes and scientists to his facility,
Your test assignment will vary depending on the manner in which you have bent the world to your will.
to barely hiding his disdain for the homeless people they had to replace them with.
Listen up down there. That thing's called an elevator, not a bathroom.
And eventually, the messages lead to his health deterioration and anger, eventually ranting on life giving him lemons in the game's most famous rant.
When life gives you lemons, don't make lemonade. Make life take the lemons back. Get mad! I don't want your damn lemons! What am I supposed to do with these?
Take the lemons.
Demand to see life's manager. Make life rue the day it thought it could give Cave Johnson lemons. Do you know who I am? I'm the man who's gonna burn your house down. With the lemons!
Oh, I like this guy.
I'm gonna get my engineers to invent a combustible lemon that burns your house down!
His house down. Burning people. He says what we're all thinking.
Just like the hidden rooms and the slow realization of GLaDOS' true nature in the first game, the strength of all this comes from you, the player, piecing this together as you wander through the old facilities. Once again, it's hard to see how this would translate to a movie where Chell would likely just walk from chamber to chamber, listen to Cave Johnson ranting, and then speak her conclusions out loud as if the audience is stupid. This is coupled with the slow, gradual realization that GLaDOS is actually Carolyn, Cave Johnson's secretary, and possibly more based on how he talks about her. As he was dying, infected by ground-up moon rocks, he'd insisted on developing the tech to upload someone's personality to a computer. As he died before it could be completed, he insisted that Carolyn instead be the one to be uploaded to the computer to run the facility. The realization of this isn't far off the realization of who GLaDOS is in the first game either. It's slow, gradual, and pieced together through discovery. It's all background while you're playing, and your brain pieces it together as you go. Hell, you may even click onto something being up like I did the first time you hear Carolyn's voice, as she is unsurprisingly played by Ellen McLean, the voice of GLaDOS.
Isn't that right, Carolyn?
Yes, sir, Mr. Johnson.
The Portal games at their heart are a mystery, but one that you have to solve yourself. The game gradually feeds you scraps of information and you have to piece it all together, and funnily enough, that makes the story a sort of meta-puzzle that has to be solved outside the physical puzzles of the test chambers. And that ultimately is why Portal's story across both games can only ever exist as a game. There are so many subtleties and nuances that have to be pieced together as the game progresses. The writing is top-notch, but it responds to the player and feeds the player the right information at the right times. It's a story that happens while something else is going on, but one that also never feels like an afterthought, which is especially impressive considering the initial builds of the game really were just the chambers with no storyline. Portal is video game storytelling done absolutely right. It encourages the player to be an active participant in its story, and it reacts to your performance, as evidenced by hidden bits of dialogue that happen if you trap yourself or do weird things. It never makes itself obvious and lets slow realization creep in while you're figuring out how to bust yourself out of each room. But it also works so well because the dialogue is so damn effective. GLaDOS regularly makes appearances on favourite video game villain lists for a reason, because she isn't just a maniacal AI out for murder, she's somehow colder, presenting an almost friendly affectation that barely disguises the malice behind it. She's petty too, from her passive aggressiveness to her playground insults that should be beneath a hyper-intelligent AI of her power. It's also just really funny. Every part of the script balances its dread with humour. The games would not have succeeded as well as they did if they'd been more straightforward. The dark comedy elevates it. It's a solid team too, with a satirist from Cracked, improv from the co-creator of The Office, the comedic timing of J. Jonah Jameson himself, the tragically funny songwriting of Jonathan Coulton, and, of course, the excellent vocal talent of Valve's own Alan McLean, bringing together some of the sharpest, wittiest dialogue I've seen anywhere in gaming, with only Psychonauts rivaling it, and oh look, members of that writing team worked on Portal 2. Game stories are often standard stories with gameplay wrapped around them. Portal's story is something that holds together a gameplay concept, and one that was meticulously crafted to work, unlike later imitators that would straight up patch in a story on an otherwise bland puzzle game. Yes, I'm looking directly at you, Cube. I know what you did, and I could tell when I played you. Portal is a classic, and one that's definitely endured because, dear god, it's been almost a decade since we last seen Portal around, and I still see that goddamn lemon speech everywhere. But it would not have gotten any of that acclaim without making a story that could only be told in this specific medium. Portal is a masterpiece of video game storytelling, and one that is yet to be bettered. And on that note, you should probably all leave before I turn on the neurotoxin emitters. Goodbye.
Well, here we are again. It's always such a pleasure. Remember when you tried to kill me twice? Oh, how we laughed and laughed. Except I wasn't laughing. Under the circumstances, I've been shockingly nice. You want your freedom.